and ghouls. Remember, if you enjoy these videos, please hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends. If you really enjoy what you see, make sure you Hulk smash that subscribe button. But now it is time for another deep dive. Now, last week we talked about Hero Magazine Illustrated. We dove super deep into the entire magazine. We talked about basically all the articles, a lot of the ads in there. It was super fun. I premiered it live, and I want to keep doing this once a week. I had a couple of different requests for some different magazines, but the first one that really caught my attention was Comics Scene. Now, Comics Scene has had two very different incarnations, and we're going to be looking at Volume 1 today. Now, Hero Illustrated came out in 1992, almost 10 years to the month after this first issue of Comics Scene. Now, on the cover you can see here, we've got Stan Lee and Jim Shooter. This is going to be a great episode. It is super long, though. I just went all out on this one. I think it's probably going to be a two-parter. So without further ado, let us go ahead and get right on into things. Now, as I said, this is from January of 1982. So Bizarre Beauties aren't made anymore, but Jeff Death of Death Studios definitely does still make masks. He's actually got an online store. It's pretty impressive. His Tor Johnson mask is absolutely insane. I know of him because he has a deal with Trick or Treat, and they do mass produce some of his masks, but he does like one-off version. He makes his own versions through his own mail order site online. So if these, pique your interest, check out his site because he's got crazy updated cool versions of these. Now, jumping right on in here. This is talking about the industry being in trouble. I tell people this is not a new thing, and they do not believe me. But this right here, this 1982 article is proof. The industry was really in a slump sales-wise. Like, the numbers were down, but the emergence of the direct market was just beginning to allow for smaller sale numbers of non-returnable comics to make comparable money to what newsstand sales of much higher numbers were. So what is newsstand versus direct market? Well, traditionally a newsstand is like basically a newsstand where you would get a newspaper, but it also includes places like mom and pop stores, grocery stores, that kind of place. And they could return their orders for refunds. Now, they had to tear the covers off, which is why you see so many old comics without covers on them. It was for return purposes. But what happened was, sales just got so terrible that people didn't think they were going to make it anymore. So what they essentially did was a guy named Steve Geppi came up with the idea of the direct market. The direct market was selling directly to the newly emerged scene of like comic book collectors, specifically through specialty shops, comic book shops. And these were offered at a much higher discount initially. But the catch was they are non-returnable. There was a huge thing with distribution at the time as well, and I really don't want to get into that with Diamond and why they're not a monopoly and how they came into the game. But this is very interesting to read. It's being 1982 and seeing so many of the same things that you hear said today about the industry and how it's dying and how it might not be around. Kind of lets you know how cyclical things are. Keep buying comics, guys, but don't be horrified that your favorite title is going to go away tomorrow. This is not a new thing. They also go out of their way to point out that they're not trying to kill any fanzines with Comic Scene, and that they're going to be looking at more, quote, mainstream books. They're going to try to be the mainstream magazine. They talk about how close-knit the fanzine community is and how the aim of Comic Scene is to utilize their wide newsstand distribution to reach new and different people and get them interested in comics, because less and less people are being introduced to comics through the newsstand since less and less comics are being sold on the newsstand. There's a couple of things later on in this magazine that they directly stole from fanzines, despite what they say here. And it's kind of interesting. I'll point them out as we go along. So Comic Scene is based on Starlog. Now, Starlog was itself mimicking a magazine called Cinefantastique, and that was a fanzine that started in 1967 and then went quarterly sometime around 1970. It was meant to one-up stuff like Famous Monsters of Filmland, and it did that by utilizing full-color pages. Starlog became known as the science fiction equivalent of Cinefantastique, and it eventually earned a reputation as the fanboy zine. In 1982, 6 years into the successful Starlog magazine, Starlog tried to do a comic book magazine, and that's this Comic Scene. It lasted less than a year with only 11 issues ever coming out, and while they would become known more as a magazine that reported about comic movies and adaptations rather than the actual industry or actual comic books, this first issue isn't really like that at all. It does talk a lot about movies, but all of these magazines did. This gets into some great details about what's going on with the industry at that point. And with that in mind, let's check out this Pacific ad. Elfquest is a trilogy collection of the first 5 issues of the original Elfquest series by Wendy and Richard Pini. This was 1982, and they were well into the original 20-issue run by this point. Pacific was offering the material up in color for the first time, though, really. This was the beginning of the big push for Elfquest to get into the mainstream. This was put out by Starblaze Graphics, I believe. And a few years later in 1985, Marvel's Epic imprint actually reprinted the entire original 20-issue series, usually called the Original Quest, also in color, bringing it to even more of a mainstream audience. Because Marvel had a completely different page count in their books, though, the Pinis had to come up with new pages and sequences to break up the stories and fix the pacing issues that resulted from this. So interestingly, these updated Epic pages are basically now part of Elfquest and have been included by the Pinis in almost every collection released of Elfquest since the Marvel releases. While Elfquest was definitely kicking up a storm by 1982, the exposure with Marvel put them on the map. The Pinis severed all ties with Marvel, though, almost immediately, and they only licensed those original 20 issues to them in hopes of parlaying that exposure and success into more stuff from their own creator-owned company, Warp. While a lot of people remember Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles and Eastman and Laird, Elfquest has been going for more than 40 years now, and the Pinis put it out themselves, except for issue 1. Issue 1 was originally released in Fantasy Quarterly by IPS, which was Independent Publishers Syndicate, I believe. It was on newspaper print stock, it was uncoded, it looked awful. The Pinis were horrified by the publication and started their own company, Warp, to publish Elfquest in 1977. What's more interesting is that the Pinis sued Pacific's imprint, Starblaze Graphics, who were putting this out, for an unauthorized reprinting of Elfquest material and for trying to assert copyright claims to a series that they were putting out for a woman named Colleen Duran. A Distant Soil, which has been offered up by a few companies, basically has been running since 1978 or so and is now being put out by Image Comics. Apparently, Starblaze Graphics tried to steal A Distant Soil from Duran way back in the 80s, which she thought was the Pinis, and there was a bunch of lawsuits and countersuits and stuff, all which settled out of court. Starblaze returned the rights of A Distant Soil to Warp, and the Pinis then in turn returned it to Duran. It was a whole big ugly thing, and it was just a mess. Also, there is this amazing Moon Knight portfolio by Bill Sienkiewicz. This thing is really kicking off lately with all the interest in Moon Knight lately, and if you've ever checked it out, it is a great portfolio if you're into Bill Sienkiewicz back when he looked kind of like Neal Adams, basically. There's also Jack Kirby's Captain Victory. Captain Victory is often remembered as one of the worst Jack Kirby comics. There's a lot of evidence that points to the fact that he only did Captain Victory because he would be allowed to retain the rights and control the series himself. Jack Kirby worked with Pacific on a number of other things, most notably the Howard the Duck Lampoon Destroyer Duck, which we'll actually hit on a little bit later on in this issue, interestingly enough. Captain Victory didn't really do much or have much going on until the end of the run, But then it got weird. It ran for 13 issues, and towards the end, Kirby started to make up an origin for Captain Victory, and he basically unofficially tied it to the New Gods. Sections of Orion's gear, including his, transport, and a few other things pop up. While no one's mentioned by name, it's very obvious. Mark Grell's Star Slayer is obviously famous for not only serving up Dave Stevens' greatest creation, The Rocketeer, in issue 2, but also, people don't remember today, but Gru the Wanderer first showed up in issue 5. Now, Steve Gerber is suing Marvel for the rights to Howard the Duck. If you want all the details, check out my old video. There should be a link around here. If not, there'll be one in the description. Jack Kirby, Neal Adams, Alfredo Alcala, Sergio Aragones, there are guys like Mark Evanier and Scott Shaw are all donating their time and working on the series for free to help with Gerber's legal costs as he fights for control of Howard the Duck during the production of what Marvel is hoping is going to be the first of their big blockbusters, Howard the Duck. Steve Gerber sued Marvel for the rights to Howard the Duck. Now, he lost this fight, but it did set a precedent, and along with Gary Friedrich, who lived long enough to finally see Marvel forced to admit that they were being wankers, are super important. If you don't know, Gary Friedrich is the guy who created Ghost Rider, and for years he said that if they pushed him too hard, he would sue them, and eventually he did. If you want to know more about the Gary Friedrich lawsuit, get in the comment section and let me know. That is a whole different thing. Like, Marvel came in, they shut him down, they told him that he wasn't even basically allowed to sell even Ghost Rider merchandise. The suit went back and forth, being overturned by judges for years, and Gary Friedrich, I think, is like the first guy who really won a suit against Marvel. They say that Jack Kirby is going to be doing the layouts after recovering from a quote-unquote accident in this article. The story back in 1982 was that Jack Kirby had been in this car accident and he hadn't been able to make it to the San Diego Comic-Con to headline for the very first time ever that year as he was busy recovering. The truth was he was recovering, but it wasn't from a car wreck. He'd had a heart attack and he ended up getting bypass surgery. He was so worried that Ruby Spears and DC would fire him. He actually came up with an official cover story that he used, which was this car accident story. And it wasn't until years later that people found out the actual truth of what had happened to him. Another interesting thing they mention is that things are going so well for Eclipse Comics that they're planning on expanding, and they're going to be putting out a Steve Englehart, Marshall Rogers, Madame Xanadu series. I'm not sure how that would have even worked. Mike Kaluta, I'm pretty sure, came up with Madame Xanadu. And he did that for DC for their last ever mystery title from the 70s, Doorway to Nightmares. There's a single issue of Madame Xanadu that did come out in 1981 by Englehart and Rogers with cover art and a story by Mike Kaluta, plus some really early Brian Boland work for the company and a backup story as well. But Englehart claims that there was a problem with getting paid by DC, so there were never any more issues besides that one shot. And I don't know how Eclipse thought they were going to put out a series, of a character that's owned by DC. None of them owned the rights to Madame Xanadu. I know for sure that Eclipse never released a Madame Xanadu series, but I looked to see if they maybe released it under a different name or something, and I don't think that ever happened. Eclipse are also releasing The Price, which is part of Jim Starlin's Metamorphosis Odyssey series. What's crazy about the Metamorphosis Odyssey is that Part 1 is in Epic Illustrated 3 by Marvel, and Part 2 is in this Pacific, release, and then Part 3 is in a Marvel graphic novel. I think it's Marvel graphic novel number 3, in fact. He owned this series, and he could do whatever he wanted with it, but not a lot of other guys were publishing their stuff with other people, and especially not part of these larger overarching stories or anything. I thought that was super interesting. Okay, Arion, no one cares about Arion. I'm not going to waste time talking about him because this is going to be a long video. Howard the Duck, the lawsuit. Now we're talking about the movie, and none other than Stan Winston says that he's still got the go-ahead for all his work, and he's moving ahead with the production of the suit that they will utilize for the movie. And that suit's going to use the same technology and puppetry as Yoda and Chewbacca. And what they call in this article the Exterminator, which I can only assume is referring to the fake Terminator head that he made for the Terminator. But man, that's a crazy typo. People do not realize how unrecognized the Terminator was in 1982. The reason that the studio and Winston aren't worried is because of the deal that they signed with Marvel. At this point, it was so in the air that creators were going to start suing Marvel and DC left and right that they actually only managed to sell the script to someone because Marvel put in a clause that if Steve Gerber, or anyone else for that matter, sued them for control or copyright, that Marvel would bear the sole responsibility, legally and monetarily, for that lawsuit and all fallout from it. So no one at the movie studio even cared, and Marvel, I think, was pretty sure that they would beat Steve Gerber, but that is a ballsy move on their part. Bonus, there's also a super cool early sculpt here that you can see down at the bottom of what Stan Winston intended Howard the Duck to look like. It's so close to the comic. It's crazy. I'm conflicted about the movie. I love it. But I hate Marvel, and I hate the way they treated Steve Gerber, and I don't like the way that they treated Steve with the movie, and I don't like the way that they treated the character of Howard the Duck with the movie. But as a kid, when I saw Howard the Duck, not gonna lie, loved it. Leah Thompson in bed with that duck. Oh man. Yep. So there are 4 new books coming from Marvel. I love how the Image has Star Trek and She-Hulk totally burying the leads on this one. Marvel and Hasbro have signed their big deal, and Marvel's going to start getting the TV ads and tie-ins of their stuff with Hasbro that will become so intrinsic to their 1980s modus operandi. So there's a big push going on. The first book that they're going to be putting out in this Hasbro deal is G.I. Joe. The creative team of Larry Hama and Tom DeFalco, along with Archie Goodwin, is already in place. And it's interesting to sell the book. They go out of their way to point out that Larry Hama has actual army training with explosives, and that Archie Goodwin worked on DC war titles like Blazing Combat. Even though I believe it wasn't Blazing Combat by Warren. Anyway, they also mentioned that it was originally going to be a one-shot, and Marvel has already decided to make G.I. Joe an ongoing before it ever went into production. That's how sure Marvel was that G.I. Joe was going to be a success. And they were not wrong. This series is actually super important, and the silent issue is a big deal these days. It's finally starting to catch on with the secondhand market. So a lot of people get to that age where they realize that a lot of what they liked and what they actually remember about G.I. Joe and the mythology and the characters did not come from the show, did not come from the toys, but they came from the comics, and specifically they came from Larry Hama, and especially during this initial Marvel run. That silent issue of G.I. Joe is legendary, and seriously, it's amazing. If you've never checked it out, go check it out. Like right now, it's insane to buy on the secondhand market at this point, but you can get plenty of reprints. I think IDW just put out a collection that was all of the silent issues of G.I. Joe, actually. The next book that they're releasing is Team America, based on toys by Ideal. The Ideal toys were basically Evel Knievel ripoff toys, and the story is insane. The characters are actually spun off from Captain America, believe it or not, where they first appeared. And this group of racers can manifest an ability to transfer their knowledge and skills into another person. And the other person has no knowledge or memory of this. They never remember being essentially taken over, and they become what's referred to sometimes as the Dark Rider and sometimes the Marauder. Obviously, the Marauder or the Dark Rider, whatever, fights crime. mostly racing related, but they later got dragged into a whole thing with the New Mutants because of Danielle Moonstar and her mutant abilities. And after this throwdown, they actually meet Xavier, and he tells them that not only are they mutants, but they can't use the name Team America anymore. Oh no, Marvel lost the rights to that name, and they had to change it to Thunder Riders. So that was the whole purpose, I think, of the X-Men tie-in, was to be like, nope, they're mutants, and now they're also Thunder Riders. You know, because Thunder Riders, doesn't that sound awesome? I bet they hung out with Bloodstrike. They should have done a crossover with Bloodstrike. They say that the next 2 titles are probably going to be Wonder Man and Ant-Man. Scott Lang had just had his 2-issue premiere in Marvel Premiere, and everyone was pretty sure that David Michelinie was going to be helming an Ant-Man series. It's a real shame that they didn't go ahead with that, in my opinion. Wonder Man would get his own series, but it wasn't until a few years later. The next one totally kind of makes up for anything else that they might not have published, though. They announced that Chris Claremont is for sure doing a Wolverine miniseries, and that Frank Miller will, quote, probably do the art. It legit gets less than like 3 sentences and is one of the shortest write-ups in here, although it does get mentioned a few times. No one saw this Wolverine series coming. It completely changed the character. I don't think people today like really understand just how much of what they think of when they think of Wolverine, and Logan for that matter, how much of that comes from this miniseries. It was absolutely revolutionary. Frank Miller brought in many of the visual elements that people think of when they think of Wolverine. And Chris Claremont really refined the character. They brought in the Oriental, like the Orient, you know, Wolverine. I guess it was supposed to be Japanese most of the time, but it never really played that well in the comics. I don't mean like Oriental as in I can't tell the difference between Japanese and Chinese, but I think a lot of times the writing, there wasn't much discerning between the two. So there's also a tiny sentence about the 4-issue Vision and Scarlet Witch mini-series. That series has meant nothing for, what, like 30 years now? But there's a ton of spec going on right now, because it probably is going to play a big part in the basis for the upcoming Disney Plus show, Vision and Scarlet Witch. This, however, has a crazy little twist. While they did nail that Bill Mantlo would be on the title, Rick Leonardi ended up doing the art. This article says that Bill Sienkiewicz is going to be handling art duties. I cannot imagine what the series would have looked like if Bill Sienkiewicz had taken some time off Moon Knight and worked on Vision and Scarlet Witch. Especially with the Sam Hain issue, it would have looked amazing. I mean, I'm super happy he stuck with Moon Knight, but it's sad that he could never fit it into his schedule, apparently. Bill was definitely super busy on Moon Knight, and he ended up doing his first little forays into the X universe with the X-Men 159 right around this time period. So his plate was just super full. But it would have been super interesting to see. Man, I think his Vision and Scarlet Witch would have been drop dead killer. Marvel is dropping plans to adapt Rocky 3, and Conan has been delayed until the movie releases because Marvel doesn't know what to adapt. That's not because Conan was like a crazy off schedule movie or because they went like totally off script or anything. It's just because there wasn't wonderful communication at this point in between the guys making the movies and the guys doing the movie adaptations. No one wanted to send out stills from the movies so that they didn't get leaked. No one wanted to send out copies of the script. And really, honestly, no one in comics wanted to like take the time to read the scripts and look at the pictures and adapt that stuff for the most part. They say here that there's going to be an Annie piece from Leonard Starr and the Blade Runner adaptation written by Archie Goodwin and drawn by Al Williamson. That stuff did come out. The Blade Runner series even has a cover by Jim Steranko, but they completely fudged a bunch of dialogue and quotes, and it was terribly received. It's for the aforementioned reasons. Like, they just didn't have the script, and they probably didn't have the script. I can't say for sure. If they did, they didn't read it. And if they did read it, they definitely didn't read it close enough. And like, I love Al Williamson, but like, he phoned it in on that series hardcore. They definitely, you can tell with Al Williamson at this period, they didn't have reference material because it would have looked better. Jim Steranko also, that is just a hideous cover. Star Trek is getting canned with issue 18 in November. There's an announcement for that year's 48-page annuals, with a special note that Bob Layton is going to be coming back to work on that year's Iron Man annual, as well as occasionally doing specials and other stuff, even though he's left the series. When I was growing up, Iron Man had nothing. There was no arcs, there was no interesting series, there was not a lot of interesting characters going on. The only thing other than his origin, really looking back on Iron Man, that stood out to any of us who were interested in the character was Demon in a Bottle, that story of Tony Stark's alcoholism, which itself introduced Rhodey Rhodes for the first time, right? So Bob Layton introduced all this amazing stuff to Iron Man, and then I don't know what happened. I don't know if he got burnt on the series. I don't know if he just wanted to walk. I don't know if Marvel wasn't paying him enough or what happened. But Bob Layton left the series. Iron Man never recovered. War Machine's a great character. He really is. There was some cool stuff written for him, which I'm glad is finally starting to come back into style, as some of the 90s stuff is a little bit less passé. But definitely Bob Layton was sorely missed. If I remember, Layton kept up covers for a while for sales reasons, and I think probably because he was getting paid enough by Marvel. And he loved the character. He did pinups for a while for the series on interiors. I know that for sure. There is a bunch of editorial and just shuffling going on at DC in general. As I mentioned, sales are in a huge slump, and not only is management moving around, but Saul Harrison, who had been with DC since they were still National Periodical Publications alone, was retiring. So they had to hire a new vice president, and a ton of other people had to kind of shift around as a result. Dick Giordano gets promoted to managing editor. Joe Orlando became the editorial director. And probably most interesting is the fact that the editorial coordinator, Karen Berger, will be working closely with and reporting directly to Dick Giordano. I think this is the first mention of Karen Berger I've ever seen. It's definitely the earliest prominent mention of Karen Berger I've ever seen in print. If you're wondering who Karen Berger is, she of course would go on to head up DC's Vertigo imprint, and she didn't just lead, she invented the British invasion, hiring Alan Moore, Neil Gaiman, Grant Morrison, and Brian Boland, just to start off with a few names. Karen Berger played probably more of a pivotal role editorial-wise in shaping modern comics than any other editor that I can actually think of, and that is saying something. And this is really proof of her. She did not come out of nowhere. You did not do that as a woman in comics. She was working her way up the ladder even at this point, and it was super cool to see her name. Dick Giordano is refusing to give up his art duties despite his promotion. He says he just loves it too much, and they're going to have to basically drag him away kicking and screaming from drawing comics. Dick Giordano specifically mentions an Atari's Special Projects account, and Giordano says that he's been working with them super closely for a while at that point, and he's not giving up on it because they have a rapport. This is the relationship that would actually lead to the first Atari Force comics, which only lasted 5 issues, published in 1982, and were designed to illustrate storylines for video games being released by Atari, who was also owned by Warner at that time. The mini-comics were packaged in with the games. Defender, there was Berserk, Star Raiders, Phoenix, and Galaxian. And there's stories by Jerry Conway. I know Roy Thomas did some. I know Ross Andrew did some art. Gil Kane did some stuff. Dick Giordano obviously did some stuff. And then Mike DiCarlo as well. Atari Force would actually go on to become its own series and last something like 20 issues apart from these mini comics that were packaged in with the Atari games. Notably, I also think that these Atari mini comics, they played a pretty important role in the decision to include mini comics with stuff like He-Man, which became an intrinsic part of the He-Man mythology and the brand and stuff. Marvel adapted the story from the Phoenix mini comic and they spun it off into Atari Force. The reason I know anything about Atari Force is because Jose Luis Garcia Lopez did it, and like Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, I think is one of the most underrated comic artists of all time. I happen to love him. If you like Batman merchandise or promotional material and illustrations between like the mid 70s and early 90s, you might think that that's Jim Aparo. You might think it's Neal Adams. It's probably Jose Luis Garcia Lopez. He also has done a couple of Batman one-shots that just really blew my mind over the years. And he indelibly left his mark on the character. Now, Giordano also talks about how the direct market is the only thing that really matters. And he plans on concentrating on that direct market. He's conscious of what books are doing overseas as well, which is not something a lot of people were thinking about or bringing up at this point. Neal Adams is going to be releasing Miss Mystic for Pacific Comics, which is a really big deal at the time. He hadn't really done a full story since Muhammad Ali vs. Superman in like 1978. Adams spent years fighting for creator rights and the return of original art and trying to unionize the industry during the 70s. He earned a lot of enemies. So he kind of stepped back from stuff and he went into commercial art, where he was much more successful. But you can see a lot of the distinctive, what you would think of as the Neal Adams Batman style, kind of fading away as he got much more into the grind of stuff. Between 1982 and 1984, he only put out, I think, 2 issues of Miss Mystic with Pacific, and then he started publishing the title under his own company, Continuity Comics, in like 1987, and that ran until 1994 with a volume break in there in the 1990s. The write-up is interesting because Adams says that she's not a witch. She's something else entirely, which will only be revealed after, quote, many issues. But she wasn't. Miss Mystic was just a witch who got burned at the stake at the Salem witch trials and managed to use her magic to transport back to another time and place. I think it was another time and place. Might have been even another dimension. This series is super aimed at environmentalism though. And it's about the dangers of pollution and our connection to the earth and stuff. It is super weird. I always felt like Neal Adams kind of like lost it after he got so big in the 70s. And Miss Mystic is a great example of that if you want to check it out. Interestingly though, Neal Adams, who fought for creator rights, as I mentioned, specifically spent a long time fighting for the rights of one artist in particular, Jack Kirby. And I'm sure that it is no coincidence that the debut of Neal Adams' first comic in almost 4 years and an original creation of that is going to be in the pages of Kirby's Captain Victory #3. And he brings it up and they point it out here in this article. There's a pretty big write-up on the upcoming Muppets comic strip, which is supposedly going to be huge. It did last a few years, from 1983 until 1986, I believe. It might have been mid-1982 to 86. And it's definitely the creator's kind of claim to fame, as it appeared in several hundred newspapers at the time it ended publication. I honestly didn't even know it existed, though, and I love the Muppets. I checked it out, the art is decent, but wasn't anything special. This did kind of open the door for the Muppets to enter comics a few years later. Marvel would end up adapting the Muppets Take Manhattan in 1984, and then in 1985, because of the popularity and the success of that, they launched the Muppet Babies comic for the Star imprint, all of which I remember. This strip, though, I have zero recollection of. The guys who did it are these two brothers, Guy and Brad Gilchrist. I have no clue what Brad is up to, but Guy is a retired animator, country music star, and a motivational speaker. And though he does still dabble in the motivational speaking, from what I understand, this strip is still his big claim to fame as far as I know. So I don't know how successful at any of the animation or speaking or anything that he was. The Chipmunks, yeah, okay. You're going to see some stuff that pops up here that you're like, wow, what? Most of this is comics, but yeah, there are definitely hints of what comic scene would become. So the Chipmunks is getting ready to kick back off on TV. I remember when this came back on, and man, it was huge. There are those CGI movies and stuff now, but I think people have forgotten that the Chipmunks, cartoon-wise, disappeared for a long time. After their creator died in 1972, his son kind of just forgot about the Chipmunks, and they sat until the late 70s. He then tried unsuccessfully to sell the show to a bunch of networks, but in the end, he did manage to get them to play reruns of the original show, which did okay, and he used that raised awareness to release a new album, which was pretty big. I think the album attracted the attention of Kellogg's and, Kellogg's Cornflakes. So Kellogg's decided to back the entire thing. And the only reason I bring all of this up is because it was the Kellogg's money that allowed them to hire the genius animator Chuck Jones, who was all excited about working on the Chipmunks again. And they got to do full body animation for the Chipmunks this time. In the original, they only have like limited movement with their heads and their arms. It's awful. I hate that kind of animation. So this is a bizarre but interesting article about underground comics. Jay Kennedy is said to be completing a comprehensive book on underground comics, which will be coming out sometime soon. Jay Kennedy was one of the foremost authorities and based the book on his personal collection of something like 10,000 like legit underground comics. Kennedy actually reminds me a lot of Bernard Krigstein when he talks about art. He says that fine art and commercial art are both intrinsically art and therefore both valid and interesting and just as worthy as the other. He was a comic historian, wrote articles and did profiles on prominent and underground comic artists and cartoonists for magazines, including the New Age Journal, New York Magazine, and Heavy Metal. His price guide, which did come out, was the first of its kind, and he was a real pioneer. Unfortunately, he drowned in 2007 at the age of like 50, though. It was super sad. But this write-up on his upcoming book is a kind of lead-in to this section of the magazine where they're going to be telling you about all of the underground books coming out and letting you know where to get them. This was a long time ago, like mail order days. So it's a legit list of publishers and then either addresses or the guy running its home address or P.O. box where you would write to along with a list of stuff that's coming out separated by publishers. It is an amazing little snapshot of what it was like to read comics and try to get underground stuff when I was younger. This is why a lot of these early underground publications are valuable and hard to come by. They were not easy to get. They might not have been expensive, but they were not easy to get even when they were coming out. So Last Gasp is ironically first up. Last Gasp was one of the later San Francisco underground publishers. They opened up shop in like 1970. They are important though because they took over publication on a number of seminal R. Crumb books, which are extremely historically important, including Zap, Young Lust, and Weirdo. Last Gasp was an incredible company. They put out some great stuff. On top of the R. Crumb books, they were putting out a number of other books, which you can see here. Last Gasp is also putting out a book called Street Art, which is going to be mostly newcomers to the industry and the scene, except for Paul Mabrides and a guy named Gary Panter. Now, if you've never heard of Gary Panter, he's the guy who came up with the design for the character Jimbo, which first appeared on a punk rock poster, I think for the Descendants, but quickly began to appear in underground publications. And Panter would go on to be the award-winning set designer of Pee-wee's Playhouse. Gary Panter is a genius. If you've never read any of the Jimbo material, I highly recommend seeking it out. It's not easy to come by, but it is amazing. It's groundbreaking. It's important. The easiest stuff to come by and probably the most coherent and well put together, like full Jimbo package, was a really, really good Jimbo series that was put out by Matt Groening's Bongo Comics sub-imprint Zongo Comics. Zongo was like into underground, basically underground comics. They put out some really great stuff. I will be getting into Zongo, but the Zongo Jimbo series is absolutely amazing. And if you're wondering why Matt Groening, who didn't deal with a lot of other stuff, is putting out Jimbo, it's not just because Jimbo was so amazing. If you look at the character of Jimbo as he originally appeared in the Descendants poster, I believe it's a Descendants poster, because like Gary Panter went on to work with the Descendants at some point. I think as a manager or something, but so Gary Panter, when he originally did the design, he gave him spiky hair. And if you look at the spiky hair, it is Bart Simpson's spiky hair. Matt Groening was good friends with Gary Panter. Matt Groening was really into underground comics. If you don't know about Life is Hell, where he got his start, that was basically like self-published underground stuff originally that he got syndicated. He even did like little zines and stuff. And when they really wanted him to adapt Life is Hell for the Tracy Ullman show, he decided not to do that. And he sat in like the lobby of Matt Brooks's office where he was getting ready to go do his pitch, like frantically making sketches. And one of the sketches he made is utilizing that spiky hair. That's why I think Lisa's hair looks the way it does, and I certainly know for sure from quotation that is definitely why Bart Simpson's hair looks that way. You got Ripoff Press. Now, Ripoff Press got going in 1960. It was started by Gilbert Shelton and Jack Jackson, I think is his name. There was a guy named Fred Todd and Dave Moriarty. No, it's not Moriarty. It's Dave Moriarty, I think. Because I always want to call him Moriarty. Ripoff Press, definitely best known for putting out one of the longest running, most popular, and, in my opinion, best underground San Francisco books, The Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers. The popularity of those old San Francisco underground books had kind of faded by this point, though, which makes this article all the more interesting to me. It means that, like, a lot of what Ripoff Press was putting out by this point was basically adult and erotic comics, which really aren't my bag. Though they do mention that they're going to have to raise the price of future Fabulous Freak Brothers to like $1.50 due to inflation, and are hopefully going to be putting out a book called The Lowbrow Art of Robert Williams, Mr. Bitchin' himself. The book came out a few months later and was a pretty big success, apparently. I don't have a copy of that edition myself, but Last Gasp has stuck around, and they did another hardcover version in like 1994, and I picked that up. There is some great stuff in it. It was one of the first places that I ever saw good reprints of a lot of his early Zap work, and it has a ton of his other almost impossible to find underground reprints. Unfortunately, because of that, it is insanely expensive today. But if you scour eBay, if you ever get a chance to pick it up or read it or pick it up from a local library, I cannot recommend it enough. I am a huge fan of Robert Williams. I've been into custom hot rods and stuff since I was like a kid. I got into them through the Munsters and George Barrister, and then really fell in love with the art of Von Dutch, which got me into Big Daddy Roth. And Big Daddy Roth got me into this like whole crew of house artists that he had. They did comics and other illustrations for him in his style. Those are the earliest artistic influences, along with a few comic book artists as I was starting to pick them out. I didn't know their names yet, but I can tell you now that there's guys like Jose Luis Garcia Lopez, Ross Andrew. I saw very early Sam Keith while he was inking Matt Wagner, that kind of stuff. I didn't even know their names yet, but those are probably some of my earliest artistic influences. Ed Roth was really the first guy that I ever learned his name. It wasn't until years later that I learned that Ed Roth had like a group of guys that worked in his house style. And ironically, the way I got into him, as I mentioned, was through George Barrister. And Ed Roth hated George Barrister, but I wouldn't learn about all of that until years later. This is actually how I got into Robert Williams for the first time, is his association with rat rods and the custom counterculture. If you've never heard of him, or you just want to learn more, check out the Amazon documentary, Mr. Bitchin'. I'll stick a link to it in the description below. I'm pretty sure it's streaming free with Amazon Prime too. And I know you can get it really cheap on DVD. I mean, like, I think $10 cheap, and it is more than worth the money. Kitchen Sink is in the last of the underground publishers before the move on to, quote, independent publishers, which feels weird when you read it. Kitchen Sink never really felt super, quote, underground to me, but the titles here sell the fact, and I think I might have just missed out on a lot of this period by them as I was moving out of underground stuff and into more independent material, what I would call independent material from like 1978, 79, 80. If titles like Bizarre Sex do not tell you that they aren't lying, then the fact that Power Pack number 2, written by, I think her name is Eileen Kaminsky, who was one of Robert Crumb's ex-wives or ex-girlfriends, it actually says that she, quote, recently gave birth to a baby she conceived with Robert Crumb as a way to sell the magazine. Even for me, that was bizarre to read. Kitchen Sink shut down in 1999, might have been 2000, but I remember them mostly for reprints of stuff that I otherwise would never have heard of, but would often fall in love with. They did Will Eisner's Spirit. They put out Mark Schultz's Xenozoic Tales, which is absolutely one of the greatest freaking comic books ever written. The art for that is absolutely astounding. Oh God, I'm so happy they did an artist's edition of that. So Kitchen Sink started in 1970, growing out of Dennis Kitchen's success of publishing his own underground stuff. He was inspired by guys like Robert Crumb and Gary Shelton. In the late 1970s, though, most of the head shops that Kitchen Sink was selling to went out of business due to new laws. And basically all of these underground publishers were forced to diversify into different material. Kitchen Sink diversified into the material that I am much more prone to think of when I think of Kitchen Sink. It's all of what I associate with them mostly. But it turns out that isn't the true history of Kitchen Sink. And it's cool to know how underground they started and where they ended. Talking about independent publishers, it turns out this isn't the kind of independent publisher I was thinking of. This is people's, like, P.O. boxes, like people putting out comics. You send them monies, they send you comics. It was a crazy world back then before, like, the Mike Diana trial and stuff. I'm not going to get into Boiled Angels here. That's an entire episode on its own, and a complete travesty and a miscarriage of justice, an abuse of the legal system. It makes me absolutely sick, and it did see the abolition of, like, the last of this kind of culture and this kind of society around stuff. There's also an Amazon Prime free streaming documentary about that. If you want to learn more, get in the comments section. Let me know. I will do an episode about it. If you want to watch the documentary, it's a decent overview. Fair warning, though, it's narrated by Jello Biafra. It's kind of weird. So Matt Howarth, I think, is still involved with the industry. He got started back in the 1970s, self-publishing, and he started this thing called the Housekey Studios, which released a bunch of titles. They also interestingly suggest checking out the English Knockabout comics, which is work by Brian Talbot, Bill Griffith, S. Clay Wilson, and Gilbert Shelton. I've never actually read any of Knockabout, but that's a hell of a lineup for the early 80s. I'm really going to have to see if I can track down a couple of issues if they're not too pricey. They mentioned a series called The Real Art Letter, which bills itself as the realist art newsletter. That sounds really cool. I could find zero information on it, and I don't know anything about it other than Boxall and Gebby were both contributors to both of the issues that I know were released, and I only know they were released and that they were involved because of this article. There's a list of publications that I've never heard of, but I have heard of the dude that put them out. Okay, so a lot of these guys' names I've read but never heard because they didn't get a ton of press. Clay Geary is a fairly prominent player in the underground scene and one of the people that helped bring the movement to national attention. He was originally a photojournalist that covered a ton of counterculture stuff. He was in the Navy for 4 years, and when he got out, he moved to San Francisco. That was in 1958. He was a teacher for a while and was almost ready to get his degree in English Lit when he was at Berkeley, but that was during the 60s, and he got completely distracted by the politics and never finished his literature degree as far as I know there. I'm pretty sure he did eventually get his degree, but he started on his career as a photojournalist covering stuff like the anti-war protests and stuff in 1968 because of being around all that stuff in Berkeley. Then in 1970, while working for the Los Angeles Free Press, he had a chance encounter with a guy named Roger Brand. Roger Brand worked with Robert Crumb, and he turned him on to Robert Crumb and the rest of the underground San Francisco scene, which was pretty well established and pretty mature by that point and churning out material. So it got him super stoked up. Geary wrote a ton of articles for different publications, and he started Comic World newsletter in 1973, which ran until 1984. In 1984, the underground comic was changing, and not to be left behind, Geary, still interested in the format, started the Comics Wave newsletter to cover the emerging scene of mini comics. Comics Wave newsletter ran from 1984 until 1995. Clay Geary is one of those super important guys that always was kind of behind the scenes that you just don't hear a lot about, but he was always pumping out stuff. And there's a laundry list of releases here that are available from him, and it is super cool to see him get name checked here. I also want to point out they have a call for letters, but did not get a bunch of promo letters for fake review and fake reaction. We talked about that in Hero Illustrated and how I didn't trust the letters and how I don't like that stuff. I really hate that. I find it distasteful. And while comic scene definitely went down kind of a dark path with being more about the movies and the video games and the media and collectibles and the books or the industry at a certain point, this first issue is a really impressive read, to be honest, and it stays away from a lot of that kind of stuff. So this is kind of like the main event for the entire issue. This Marvel Turns 20, they kind of recount the story of Marvel as Stan Lee would have the world believe it. But this article is a great example of why Jack Kirby and Stan Lee ended up on such bad terms. Throughout the article, even though it's not Stan Lee speaking or writing, he's consistently giving full and sole credit to basically everything. While they do point out that Joe Simon created Captain America and Jack Kirby was his co-creator, they quickly follow that up by pointing out that Stan Lee is the one who turned the sunken city in Namor into Atlantis. It's painful to read at points. As the article goes on, they give Kirby more credit. And they then, right after that, they talk about how Stan Lee had the idea to turn Thor from a myth into a superhero. Everyone knows that was Jack Kirby. It was this kind of article that upset Jack Kirby enough that he left Marvel 2 years before this article was published and basically never worked for them ever again. So even though they kind of like get Jack Kirby kind of wrong, on the upside, this article does actually mention guys like Dick Ayers and Don Heck, who are instrumental in the design of some of Marvel's most iconic creations, including Iron Man and Ghost Rider, but never get any name recognition today. They also point out that it was likely Kirby's bold new art that really helped Marvel jump off of the newsstands at people. That's nice to read. They talk about how limited distribution and a strict quota on titles required Marvel to include 2 heroes in one book, which is why you would see stuff like Captain America and Iron Man in Tales of Suspense and stuff. But then by 1968, Marvel was bought out and allowed to expand, and all the heroes got their own titles. But heroes were getting kind of passé by that point. There was a revival in monsters and fantasy books in the 1970s, which resulted in Marvel riding that wave with titles like Conan the Barbarian and Tomb of Dracula. Then, in one little tiny toss-away paragraph, they talk about how Len Wein, Marv Wolfman, Archie Goodwin, and Jerry Conway have all held the title as editor of Marvel for brief periods, but found the pressure too much over the past 6 years or so. That's a lot of editors. If you didn't notice his lurch-looking face plastered all over the cover, this is the height of Jim Shooter's run. And for all the bad stuff that I say about the guy, and I'm not apologizing for that, I have my reasons and I will get into them here in videos someday, but for now I will say that I've agreed with people in the comment sections who say I'm way too harsh on Shooter sometimes, and that he helped to rescue Marvel financially. He came in and he cleaned house, and he didn't take any crap, and he wasn't there to do anything but make money and make Marvel bigger and make the characters bolder than ever. I can get behind all of that. It's just the draconian methods that he utilized to reach his end goals that I find so important. They even mention that of all the previous editors, everyone but Archie Goodwin is writing for DC at that point, basically because of Jim Shooter. It's also interesting to me that they note Stan Lee has essentially left Marvel altogether by this point. Well, this is common knowledge to me. I'm amazed by the amount of people who think it had anything to do with Marvel after the 1970s. He was much more interested in getting movies and television shows and merchandising and stuff made. That's where the money is. That's where Stan Lee wanted to be. They even have a quote where Stan Lee says he wants to try to do a comic a year or so he doesn't completely forget how to do it. And that didn't happen, obviously. Stan Lee left Marvel to go chase Marvel Entertainment, and that never panned out for him. It was only after he lost control of the rights and that company and had to basically bow out of stuff that guys like Avi Arad were able to begin building what we would come to know of as the Marvel Cinematic Universe. While I think Stan Lee obviously enjoyed the fame and the accolades that came from him, there had to be a lot of other emotions that were in his head when he was doing those cameos in all of the Marvel Cinematic movies. He spent years trying to get that stuff off of the ground with no luck, and now it's one of the biggest parts of the movie industry. Jim Shooter gets kind of fair treatment here. They feel the same way I do about him. He's gotten a lot done. He's taking a beating over it, and he probably deserves it, but Jim Shooter is okay with that. Then Jim Shooter launches into their company man crap that he always does. Quote, I think comics would have gone down the tubes had Stan not come along 20 years ago and just on sheer creative strength alone brought the whole field to life. And, quote, publishers thought of it as quick money and throwaway stuff. No one invested any money into it. You published comics and it was not a question of if you make money, but how much. They turned out schlock with a few gems among the garbage. Most companies have to go through a period of investment and building. That never happened with comics. Totally glossing over stuff like EC and other titles that fell outside of the superhero genre, Shooter comes off extremely condescending to me here. He was involved with the industry for long enough and at a time period where he should have been aware of that stuff. His attribution of the continued survival of comic books to Stan Lee alone is a sad, pathetic ruse that absolutely bothers me more and more the older that I get and the more that I see this kind of crap. Jim Shooter's remembered today by power of his own ability to trumpet his own horn, really, for returning all types of original art to Marvel employees, better page wages, and in juxtaposition, an incredibly drawn-out battle with Neal Adams and Jack Kirby over said original art. A lot of people ask me what my big problem with Jim Shooter is, and a lot of it comes down to the fact that he claims that Jack Kirby sued Marvel Comics. That is an absolute falsity. Kirby stated repeatedly during his life he wouldn't waste his time doing it, and it wasn't until after his death in 1994 that his estate made moves to sue Marvel, which coincidentally ended up after nearly a decade with an out-of-court settlement of an undisclosed amount of money, which I can only scarcely begin to conceive the amount of. So, as a great example here, Jim Shooter, champion of the artist and all-around great guy, literally says that since Jack Kirby refuses to work for them anymore, and they can't get him to do new art for the 20th anniversary celebration of Marvel that they're going to do, they're going to take the storyboards for the original Fantastic Four cartoon show done by Jack Kirby for Marvel, and then have anyone that they damn well please ink over the top of it. I mean, that's just sick. That's messed up, which is why I'm glad that while Jack Kirby obviously wasn't going to be talking about pro-Marvel anything at this point, they did bother to talk to him, and they managed to get some coherent and usable quotes out of him. Jack Kirby talks about how Marvel has no idea what they're doing, that the days of creating characters and stories and stuff for zero ownership and less than fair compensation are gone. They're over. Quote, whatever is inside your head belongs to them, and that's wrong. What's crazy is that he even goes on to basically admit this is how the industry has always worked, and that while people were always crooked, it just has gotten worse and worse over time. Quote, somehow before there's always been a little room for compromise somewhere, but now their structure is extremely rigid, and that's wrong. I think they have to be able to be flexible on both sides. The best line from Kirby, though, I think is in reference to the Howard the Duck lawsuit, which I talked about earlier between Steve Gerber and Marvel. Quote, I would like to see some kind of precedent set because I think it would be good for everyone. Not only good for artists, but also good for the firm. Notice he doesn't say me or I there. Kirby's interested in how this will impact the entire industry, not him. He has no plans at this time or in the future to sue Marvel. And while he could have totally lashed out and said some really harsh things, which he did later in life, unfortunately, I think that here he remained pretty tasteful and truthful. It's really nice to see him quoted. Surprisingly, Jim Shooter doesn't use the entire article to just deflect on other people. And he does acknowledge that there are some problems with Marvel. Jim Shooter doesn't like how disorganized the Marvel universe is at this point. The article claims that it was because one editor was supposed to oversee every title at Marvel that everyone before Jim Shooter left. That's complete crap. Marvel was a disaster, just a dumpster wreck at this point, and it wasn't editing titles that drove those guys off. Shooter says that he has delegated a number of editors to oversee a few titles, each who all have to then in turn report back to him for final okay, except for Archie Goodwin, who is editing Epic Illustrated. Now, as I mentioned, Epic is Marvel's creator-owned imprint, and it's Jim Shooter's answer to the problem of creators' rights that keep coming up, but anyone who knows anything about Epic knows it never really played out like that for anyone. Epic put out some really great stuff, but it was a disheveled mess from the very start, and it suffered from bad distribution and even worse marketing. They then used Epic to kind of circle back to the Steve Gerber, Howard the Duck lawsuit, but this time instead of Shooter, they use a quote from Stan Lee where he talks about how people have the option to not work for them and not sign the contract, and that they knew what they were signing up for, and that he himself wouldn't sue the company because, quote, to my thinking, that would be dishonest. Now, it's important to remember that Stan Lee had been hired by Marvel as the ambassador for the company. He was the guy who was going to be their face to the world, even though he had jack to do with the comics at that point. And they paid him literal millions of dollars for this. Not a few, like tons, a lot, tens of millions of dollars. It's easy for Lee to sit back in his ivory castle after getting his job through nepotism and say stuff like that. He's in essence calling Jack Kirby dishonest because he thinks now that there's more money being made, he should maybe make a little bit more money. I get what Stan Lee is saying, and there's a degree of truth there, but again, it's got to be a lot easier to say that kind of stuff when you're making millions off of those creations. I don't care if they're royalty checks or a check to be an ambassador or whatever. Stan Lee was making bank, and Jack Kirby was making buckus. They point out the work-for-hire contract that Marvel employees were forced to sign in 1978, which relinquished all control of anything they wrote or created at Marvel to Marvel with zero reimbursement, control, or credit if Marvel didn't feel like it. Jack Kirby, Neal Adams, and a few others had left in utter disgust and refused to sign, but this is an important contract. If this contract says all this, and it redefined the definition of how you worked for Marvel, then anything made before this, say anything from 1960 until 1977, which included Jack Kirby's work, wouldn't be covered. He would basically be entitled to co-creator status. Stan Lee and Jim Shooter both repeatedly claim that Marvel has always been working to improve things for their artists and writers. That's crap. The only reason Jim Shooter was forced to institute the return of art was because of massive fan outcry and them getting constantly berated in the pages of numerous magazines. DC had been returning art to everyone without so much as a conversation for over a decade. They also had a deal in place that if you created a character, you got like 10% of any licensing deal that happened with the character. Marvel, on the other hand, nothing. Stan Lee goes so far as to claim that they lose money on a lot of stuff, and that's just kind of absorbed and, quote, they are just kept going because they are part of the whole thing. That's ludicrous. Marvel, and even at the start of this article and earlier in the magazine, is talking about axing titles. And the only reason you do that is because they aren't selling enough. And that is only important because you're not making money. A company can't exist if they're not making a profit, but Stan Lee says there's so little profit that they can't afford to give creators the rights to stuff because the industry would close down overnight since publishers wouldn't be making any money. But on the other hand, he claims a paragraph before that they publish titles that they lose money on simply to keep the whole thing going. He's so full of crap, and he has no clue what he's talking about. They mentioned in this article, he's not even affiliated with Marvel at this point anymore. He's just the ambassador. This same article goes out of the way to point out that he's not been involved with Marvel for years. He's the publisher in name only, and that's that. I don't understand why they go into this having pointed all that out. It seems super contradictory. So, this section here about Jim Shooter taking flack from the fan press will give you a good idea of what people's perception and opinion of Jim Shooter was before he disappeared and then popped back up all user-friendly for a new generation that didn't know about Jack Kirby or Neal Adams or any of his Marvel shenanigans. They talk about how he takes a lot of heat from fan publications, but he takes it all in stride. Shooter makes a bunch of deflected jokes, but there's a few things that really drive at what irks me so much about the guy. The crazy thing is, Comic Scene calls him on it. Quote, in conversation he could admit to mistakes in general, but when it comes to specifics, he takes the company line and holds to it without compromise. Is there something to be said for that? Yes. Is it a nice something? Not for me. Not when you're saying things like, I quote, have fought harder for creative people than anyone else, even Roy Thomas. It's my efforts that have gotten more money and real rewards for people. People at DC Comics are making more money because of me, because I drove our rates up. The only time that they get him to fess up to anything is a complete dismissal of the situation and those involved. Quote, what I did wrong was that I did not give what they wanted to a couple of people who are A, very names, and B, very vocal. They went to the fan press and they lost their heads. What can I do? Can I reply? Can I go back and say I'm sorry? I can't do that. So they go and tell their story, and all I can basically say is that's not true. That's not exactly the way it happened. So it's not that you didn't help out artists. It's that you didn't help out people who could actually make trouble for you that you would change. You see how that seems a little bit contradictory after making such claims as like, everybody, even people at DC, are making more money. Even though I really don't care about any artists except for guys who can make trouble for me. And how can you not say you're sorry? Does he not think that saying that might actually appease some of the vitriolic aggression between guys like Kirby and Adams towards the company? Jim Shooter is such a corporate shill. Or, quote, maybe nobody is wrong. Maybe it's just that we couldn't make a deal. Isn't that how things work? Yeah, Jim, it is how things work, but you probably couldn't make a deal because you treat people like crap. There's a lot of people that left in his first year or so as editor, but Jim Shooter says people also have joined from DC and that no one has switched back and forth since. He says he's taking Lee's approach of the dramatic as opposed to being worried about how one character, when he's supposed to be in another place in another book, which is in essence, I think, him dismissing all the problems that they had with character continuity and trying to make it a bright side of like, well, you know, I'm just trying to be dramatic and be like Stan Lee. He says this is the real reason that people left for DC, but in turn left DC to join Marvel because of this different interest in stories and storytelling. I don't buy that for a minute. It just seems like back talk to me, like double speak. Stan Lee is recently made editor, and Jim Shooter is calling it the second Marvel Revolution. He's all about consulting Lee, according to their article, and talks about hiring a guy named Jim Galton. Now, Jim Galton used to work for CBS, but when they fired him, Marvel snapped him up and made him president. Jim Shooter says that 10 or 15 years from 1982, people will remember Jim Galton as the man who saved comics. While this isn't necessarily true, he was pivotal in a few areas that did help to expand comics into markets, formats, and even directions that they just hadn't been pushed in before, namely animation and licensed properties. Jim Galton was one of the guys who heavily supported Stan Lee's repeated attempts to get good adaptations of Marvel Comics made. And so Stan Lee was obviously very fond of him, as that's what Lee is interested in with Marvel Productions, not Marvel Comics. And because Stan Lee supports him, Jim Shooter hails him as a god. Jim Galton was also a major reason that stuff like the Atari crossover comics we talked about before happened. He made a lot of really dumb decisions. He just didn't have enough experience with comics, and I don't know if he knew what to make of the industry, even though he remained with Marvel until 1991. Now, when I was reading up on Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby, I found a few quotes from Kirby where he said he'd never actually read a printed comic that he did for Marvel, and it was kind of shocking. Here we have a statement that leaves that in the dust. Lee, who is obviously just the face man and only vestigially connected to Marvel Comics, says that he thumbs through the few books he can monthly to see what they look like. Jim Galton says that he's never read all of the publications for any company that he's worked for, and he doesn't feel the need to. And Jim Shooter's answer is also along these lines. I like to rag on Shooter a lot of times because he would come up with these big ideas and then just kind of dump them on creative teams and tell them it was their responsibility to make stuff happen. Like Spider-Man's black costume. He knew that he wanted Spider-Man to change costumes. He just didn't know how, or I think particularly care, and he couldn't be bothered with how it was going to happen, so he dumped it on Tom DeFalco, and the rest is history. If you want to learn more about that, check out the Secret History of Venom video that I did. Now, here he actually says that he doesn't even bother to read the completed comics until they've been published. He says he has complete faith in his editors, but there's a ton of famous stories about Jim Shooter reading comics that had gone to print and going completely bananas on people. The Phoenix Saga is probably the most famous story. Chris Claremont, Louise Simonson, and Nocenti all say that they got approval for Phoenix, like destroying that planet from Jim Shooter. But then when he read the comic, he demanded that she face serious and long-standing, quote, repercussions from the action, which basically meant kill her or, like, you put her in permanent purgatory. It was Jim Shooter who basically engineered the death of Jean Grey as a result of his reaction to reading that comic. Jim Shooter then continues that he does this to allow the editors, writers, and artists to make mistakes and learn from them in print. This is classic Stan Lee style diversion. When asked about the, quote, Marvel method of writing, to me, this seems extraordinarily cavalier of Jim Shooter in a lot of ways. If you're actually going to let people make mistakes and stuff, that's fairly commendable. If on the other hand, you're going to force major decisions and plot devices on people as a result of that, and then I swear to God, they talk about this in the article, take a copy of the printed comic and make corrections and annotations about all the mistakes that were made in that comic and give it to that person after it's been published and call them on it. That's a horse of another color to me. It seems preposterously lazy to me. I don't understand how Jim Shooter can use this amount of doublespeak and people were supposed to take him seriously. Jim Galton drops a nugget of wisdom about how comic books have gone totally wrong. He says that the original target audience was kids between 10 and 12, and that's who books have to be written for. Galton claims it's a major mistake to write comics for anyone else, and that the books have to be written for a, quote, an 11-and-a-half-year-old boy. As Frank Miller's run on Daredevil continued, then there was Dark Knight Returns, Watchmen, Squadron Supreme, and a host of other titles very shortly that would all prove that Jim Galton had no clue what he was talking about. There should always be titles written for kids. Yes, that's not in question. But completely ignoring the adult section of your fan base, which at this point was widely publicized and highly vocal when it came to Marvel especially, was just a dumb move. The direct market accounts for 33% of Marvel sales by this time, according to this article. And those are all adult readers buying comics from specialty shops that carry only comics and like comic magazines. Lately, we hear a lot about print runs. But in 1982, Marvel was reaching about 77% of all children in America between 6 and 17. With more than 15 million people buying 5 million Marvel comics a month. The best titles selling around 400,000 copies. Today numbers are around 40 to 50,000 for big books. The market just keeps shrinking, and they mention that in the article here too. Superman was selling 2 million copies a month in 1966, but only 500,000 copies by 1982. Jim Shooter and Jim Galton, along with Stan Lee, blame easy access to TV. And I think this is one of the big reasons Stan Lee just got to do his thing for so long, even though he was never successful. Jim Galton thought it was super important that they try and maintain a really strong television presence, and he just kind of let Stan Lee go and squander all of this money and time and effort. Galton and Shooter then discuss why the Marvel magazines have basically all been shut down. For anyone who doesn't know, Marvel began publishing black and white magazines, which contained original comic stories that were too adult for regular Marvel comics at the time. They were printed in black and white, mostly in an attempt to keep the costs down. And Shooter says that they were shut down because they were selling terribly, and Galton says they couldn't give them away. Shooter goes on to say that the black and white magazines that they have kept are undergoing a major change. He had a meeting with the editors and told them that they should, quote, be more adult in the sense of the stories and avoid the softcore porn and stuff that are some of the black and white Warren magazines. Warren was on its way out, and a lot of their titles had just kind of devolved at this point. But it does seem kind of like a cheap shot from Jim Shooter at Warren at this point, especially considering that Marvel and DC had sniped a lot of big talent from especially Geary and Creepy over the years. The only real hit they had with any of the magazines and the larger format stuff was Star Wars. Now, Jim Galton, in response, has just signed a deal for the Marvel movie adaptation series, and specifically with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and he's really excited for them. That series did terribly, and there's a reason that no one remembers 99% of them today. Jim Galton is the guy who also introduced the Hanna-Barbera comics to Marvel in 1970, which lasted like all 11 or 12 months. He has a new bright idea for Dennis the Menace, though. Dennis is going to be celebrating his 30th anniversary as a strip, and he literally says, quote, I can see college students buying Dennis the Menace. I really can. They didn't, and this man is a gibbering buffoon. Okay, So this is interesting. Comic Scene says that despite what Marvel might think and what they do, the direct market is going to play heavily into things. And it does. They were extremely right. And it seems like Marvel is either not fully acknowledging or not fully aware of what is going to happen or the potentiality for or of the direct market. Comic Scene also points out that while Marvel likes to pretend that they invented the fan market, it was well on its way to becoming an organized thing before the publication of Fantastic Four #1, which is pretty cool actually, as well as highly accurate and extremely strange considering they basically contradict this later on in the magazine. One of the final articles, it's super weird. They talk about how basically they don't say it outright, but they explain how Marvel created comic book fandom. And yet in this article, they specifically go out of their way to point out that's not the case. It's super weird. Now we really get into the direct market. At this point, comics had taken a major blow and there were major problems with distribution for everyone on basically every level. In response, a man named Steve Geppi, basically with a few other guys, came up with the idea of a direct market, where the idea is publishers could sell their books directly to specialty comic books at a higher discount than newsstands, but that these comics would be non-returnable, as I said. If a newsstand didn't sell or want to keep the copies that they hadn't sold, when the next issue came out, the comic could be returned. This meant the numbers that publishers had to sell on the direct market was drastically smaller than on the newsstands, but Marvel was kind of slow to catch on to that for some reason. Jim Shooter says, though, that there's a big problem. They're set up to print millions of books a month, and the smaller specialty shops just simply don't have the space to stock it all. Marvel has had to take this into heavy consideration and is pacing out the releases accordingly so they don't completely choke out the comic book shop shelves. This is weird. It's basically Jim Shooter saying that they can't sell enough comic books even though the entire industry is in a major slump and they're making more money per capita. It's kind of like the idea behind Image Comics where they said like, hey, we only have to sell like 30,000 copies of our comic to make what we're making working for Marvel, which is what made the whole thing logistical and makes sense for a lot of those guys. So Jim Shooter is excited about a title called Marvel Fanfare, which is going to utilize inventory stories. Inventory stories are stories that are either completed or mostly completed but never saw the light of day, and that's usually for a reason. Al Milgrom, who edited the entire first volume, wanted to publish the best of the best comic with the best artists and writers teaming up for stories on the best paper stock and the highest quality printing possible. These are kind of two contradictory concepts for a book. The book cost double what a regular book did. It was direct market only and was supposed to just be an amazing book, and it just wasn't. The results were usually an extremely mixed bag, and a lot of stuff just did not work. Inventory books are almost never good, especially when a title is conceived as relying on that stuff. It's going to be a shaky proposition, which is why Jim Shooter says it's taken them a few extra months to get it done because stories were in varying states of completion. Marvel Fanfare was definitely aimed at comic fans and the emerging direct market, but it always underperformed. And I think Jim Shooter took that as like a sign that, okay, we're not going to do super great in the direct market and these people aren't actually that interested, when he should have been actually taking that as a sign of Marvel Fanfare isn't that good of a book, especially for the price you were paying. Jim Shooter's a smart guy. While he's not ready to be reliant or even a big fan of the direct market at this point, he does say that he realizes people are more forgiving when it comes to bad writing and they'll buy books basically because of whoever is doing art on them and for other reasons that have more to do with them being readers of comics than readers in general. It's a small observation, but an astute one, which would come into play quite heavily soon enough in the industry as more and more things were aimed at these, quote, more forgiving collectors and fans. And eventually this would become the predominant way of thinking in the early 90s, again, with the Image era of things, where people did very much so care, in a lot of cases, way more about style than over substance. It never really worked out for Marvel fanfare, but, you know. They also talk about Marvel getting into miniseries. Now, I talked about this a lot more in depth in the Mark Gruenwald Squadron Supreme video, and there should be a link around here somewhere, and if there's not, get in the description. But Mark Gruenwald did Contest of Champions, and that did really well, so he got the go-ahead on Squadron Supreme. But Contest of Champions isn't even mentioned. They talk about the Hercules mini coming up, the Scarlet Witch and Vision series again, and a Submariner series that's going to be written by Jim Shooter and Alan Weiss, and they bring up the Chris Claremont Wolverine series, again pointing out that Miller will, quote, probably be doing the art. Jim Shooter says the miniseries is a response to the immediate knowledge of what sells and doesn't as a result of the emerging direct market. Really, it was a direct response to the sales that DC had with their miniseries, because Contest of Champions isn't the first ever comic book miniseries. It's just the first Marvel miniseries. And they did have some limited success with miniseries. It would get progressively better and better as time went on through the 80s for them. And there was some really, really good stuff. Like Fantastic Four versus the X-Men. I mean, that is like John Byrne at the top of his game doing X-Men and Fantastic Four in the same book on great quality Baxter paper, man. There was some good stuff. Anyway, so Jim Shooter says the miniseries is a response to immediate knowledge of what sells and doesn't on the emerging market. It's not. It's a response to DC. Like Jim Shooter says also that it's much easier for them to test out the popularity of a character with a 4-issue miniseries than it is with 4 issues presenting new characters in the pages of something like Marvel Premiere, which they are coincidentally getting rid of. And if you remember, we were talking about how David Michelinie was probably going to get that Ant-Man series for Scott Lang because he was so well received and people really wanted to see the series, but he didn't quite ever get it. You just don't get the exposure when people are having to pick up a new book for new characters every month, as opposed to like, hey, this miniseries looks interesting, I'm going to pick up this one character this month. Plus, you get a lot more space to tell the story. So the last result of the direct market, according to this article, is that Marvel is going to be moving into what the article calls the album format. What they really mean is the graphic novel format that was taking hold overseas in Europe especially, and had long been a big seller for guys like Mobius. Now, Marvel has decided that they're going to be getting into the game, but there's been a slight delay, as the first story is going to come out. The Death of Captain Marvel has been delayed, along with another of the first 3 proposed releases, Star Slammers, as Jim Starlin was in some sort of accident. I read a lot about Jim Starlin. He's a super interesting guy, but I don't know anything about this accident. I have never heard of this accident before. I do know that around this time, he was starting to have extreme run-ins with Marvel about his original creations. And while their relationship has always been rocky, Starlin has quit working for Marvel on numerous occasions. I was unable to find any interviews where he brings up an accident around this time, so I'm more inclined to think that there was a problem behind the scenes, like some cat fighting going on between Jim Starlin and Jim Shooter, who both lack the ability to back down from a fight and have really strong personalities. I happen to like Jim Starlin a lot, man, but he does. He's got a very strong personality, and sometimes he just comes on like too strong, and it takes him a while to understand that like you need to step back a little bit from his situation to gain any kind of view of it and make any kind of headway. So I think there was probably some backfighting going on right here, some behind the scenes stuff that I've never heard of, and I wasn't able to find, like written accounts of. So in 2016, Jim Starlin was involved in a freak accident, though. As I said, I really like Jim Starlin. So he severely lacerated his face, and he destroyed his drawing hand when his SodaStream machine exploded. There are these like machines that make homemade sodas called SodaStream machines. It exploded in a freak accident. He was told that he would probably never draw again. He spent years only able to write, and it took him forever to actually write. After almost 4 years of rigorous therapy, though, Jim Starlin has trained himself to draw once again, and he launched a successful Kickstarter campaign. And while there have been a lot of printing and shipping delays, most likely because of COVID and a few other things, you can pre-order your copy of the new Dreadstar graphic novel, which is over 100 pages, if I remember correctly. That's supposed to ship around June of this upcoming year, 2021. You can find a link to that in the description below. One of the big debates going on at this point in the 1980s was the skyrocketing prices of printing and the dwindling readership. DC had upped their page count and upped their prices, but Marvel had remained with their lower page count and lower prices for as long as they could. By 1982, they'd been forced to make what would be the first of several annual increases, actually more than annual increases in prices. And because of this, Galton is very skeptical of the future of comics. That is not a good thing for somebody in Jim Galton's position to be saying. It's like listening to Dan DiDio talk about DC Comics, before he left. It just seemed like they had no faith in the company. They were sure it was going down. Then get off the ship. Get on your boat and get out here and let somebody else take over. On the other hand, Jim Shooter says that they're the cheapest and easiest way to get the stuff out there. And as long as that remains the case, that's what Marvel would do. That has always historically proven to be true, and it's still kind of the case. Despite the fact that, they sell basically nothing for comic books compared to what they did even in the 80s at this point. Definitely the reason that I don't see comics going anywhere is because they are so ridiculously cheap to produce. Galton has other plans on his mind, though. He's really wanting to use his experience with CBS and their books to bring that over to Marvel, who has just started a paperback line. I know I sound like a broken record, but in 2020, this probably seems crazy, but before this, getting reprints was not an easy task. And it's one of the big reasons people got into back issues and collecting in the first place. I've actually had people ask me, I talk a lot about reading a lot of C.C. Beck, Captain Marvel and stuff, and at my age, a lot of people have asked me, where did I get reprints of stuff? I was really lucky. I had a local comic shop owner who took a shining to me because I think I read stuff that he was into and that a lot of other kids were not into. I also brought some interesting stuff into the shop for him that sold fairly well. But he let me read some absolutely incredible stuff. I mean, I definitely have seen all of Matt Baker's Phantom Lady comics, up close and personal. Those things have become ghosts over the last 20 years, but I got a chance to see some really, really cool stuff. That was not the case for everyone. And I know it seems crazy in 2020, but before this, getting reprints wasn't easy. This whole situation led to mail order, and then eventually that evolved into comic shops, and that led to the direct market, and that led to people like Jim Galton from the actual comic book publishing world starting to see some sort of symbiotic relationships where comics would be sold by comic shops, but Marvel would also sell paperback collections to non-collectors and bookstores. He and Stanley both think there's some sort of harmonious relationship for book and comic shops in the future, which is incredibly naive and outright stupid to expect competing companies of different natures to get along and cooperate like that to me. And it never panned out that way for sure. Marvel has been testing the waters for a few years with their pocketbook reprints of classic stories. And if you ever noticed, I've actually got one of the Amazing Spider-Man pocketbooks on my bookshelf, as that was the only way I could affordably read those early issues before trades and stuff. By 1982, Marvel had released a trade paperback version which collected their adaptation of The Empire Strikes Back. It did really well. The pocketbooks did really well. So Galton at this point is convinced that there's an audience who just won't pick up floppies because they think of them as embarrassing. They don't want to be caught reading a comic. Galton jokingly refers to them like bad pornography. You don't want your friends to know that you're reading bad porn, You put that same content into a book. You make it look different, more presentable, and a little bit more legitimate though, and those people are going to come out in droves. Historically, Galton did have some very valid points, but the trade would take a long time to catch on. It was really Dave Sim's Cerebus collections, often referred to as the phone book collections, that had gotten people interested in them. The guy who did Cerebus, Dave Sim, had limited stock of his issues as they were self-published, and he decided rather than reprinting singular issues to collect issues in these enormous volumes, and they became known as the telephone books. And he had a lot of success with it. This led to early tests in the market, and then when Watchmen came out, it really gained traction. But it wasn't until Rolling Stone ran a full 2-page splash ad for a Sandman collection that the trade paperback market would really kick off about a decade later. So it's very interesting to read about its earliest roots and how things worked and why the publishers even got into this stuff in the first place before all of that. So along with his push for trade paperbacks and getting comics into bookstores, which are both really good ideas, I mentioned that Jim Galton also wanted them to have a strong television presence. This was to compete with stuff like the Super Friends and the other popular DC animated series such as Shazam. Jim Galton also was putting a lot of time and effort into merchandising Marvel at this point. DC had long been into the racket, but Marvel had never enjoyed the same level of success. Although they had some of the biggest characters on the planet, they could never compete with DC's merchandising. Jim Galton says that they're going to do everything from toys to toilet paper coming up, and that they even just released a pop-up book to compete with the DC line of pop-up books. There's an Incredible Hulk and a Spider-Man pop-up book that they mentioned. At that point, when this article was written, they had both sold out, and in fact, when I looked them up, Marvel managed to get out 2 Hulk pop-up books and at least 3 Spider-Man pop-up books before the end of 1982 alone. I found a nice, decent short video showcasing one of the Hulk pop-up books to show you what they look like. There should be a banner link here somewhere, but there's a link in the description, as always, if you want to check it out. But they are amazing. While Galton was obviously out of touch with comic fans and didn't really know what comic readers wanted, he definitely knew what he was doing when it came to books. Like actual books, trade paperbacks, pop-up books. It was around this time when I was a kid, I remember these actual books of comic book characters being everywhere. And then as I got older, the graphic novel and the trade paperback kind of followed along with me. It's interesting to learn the roots of that proliferation from Marvel definitely seem to have taken strong root with Jim Galton as a response to the new avenues opened by the direct market during the dark days of the 1980s in an attempt to get more people interested in comics and making them seem more like a legitimate art and literature format, getting them into bookstores, which would ironically come only a few years later with much more adult material like Watchmen and Dark Knight Returns, Squadron Supreme, American Flag, but completely at the expense of the wider audience of the children that Jim Galton and Jim Shooter are both aiming at for in all of this initial flurry of action with books and trade paperbacks. This is the most boring part of the article to read, but historically it's most likely also the most important. This entire section is dedicated to discussing the disastrous Marvel productions. For anyone that doesn't know, Stan Lee was bored of comics. He never really wanted to be the comics guy, so he basically left Marvel in the 1970s, and he'd spent years trying to sell Marvel properties to animation studios and option big-budget Hollywood movies. But while he'd had some minor successes, most notably the Incredible Hulk TV show, that was ironically actually, I think, getting canceled in 1982, right around this time, Jim Galton still thought that Stan Lee was right. Kids weren't reading comics like they used to, and it had to be because of TV. Couldn't be because they weren't as good as they used to be. He says that if people stop reading altogether, Marvel will still be right there with them on television. In light of the Hulk show getting canned, they're concentrating on the animation department, and a new series is in the works, Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. This is so early on, though, that they haven't even named Firestar yet. She's only got her civilian name of Angelica Jones at this point. There are obviously some pretty high hopes for Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, and as they point out, Lee is going to be working closely with the production of the show, but if you've ever watched Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, first, I'm sorry, and second, you know what I'm talking about. That show is a steaming pile of shit. The soundtrack is actually rather incredible and mostly lost to time. There have been a few compiled collections from stuff that survived as library music from later studio work or was originally derived from library music to begin with. But that stuff is questionable when it comes to the rights, and I don't know how legit those releases are. Plus, they're super limited and they're always really expensive. There's hours of original music, and unfortunately at this point, I think it's been lost to time, which is a real shame, as that soundtrack was most definitely the best thing about Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends. If you want to check out some of that crazy music, there are some amazing guys who have gone through and used sound mixes to try to strip out more of the music, and they've also compiled a lot of the library music that exists, and you can find a link to that in the description below, because I know a bunch of that stuff is up on YouTube. I'll just stick on playlists to that stuff all the time. It's great. As far as the Marvel animation, when living legend Fritz Freeling basically retired, Marvel decided to buy his old animation studio and use it to produce their stuff. Strangely enough, as the animation of Spider-Man was some of the worst I've ever seen outside of like Hanna-Barbera, where the bodies didn't even move. They introduced another series in 1982, The Incredible Hulk, to, I guess, cash in on the notoriety of the recently canceled television show with Lou Ferrigno while they could. While the Hulk only lasted 13 episodes, it is still the best Marvel cartoon that they ever released prior to X-Men the Animated Series, in my opinion. The rights, I think, are really messed up, as are a lot of things with Sunbow and Deke and even the Incredible Hulk himself. And I don't think that you could ever buy the series here in the US on DVD, unfortunately. It's never been released that I know of. It's not on YouTube, as episodes quickly get taken down. But I can say that if you like to download at all, there are some incredible fan restorations out there. A company in the UK managed to license all of the stuff from a very brief period of time, and they put all of the Hulk material from every cartoon together, and they released it as a 17-hour-long DVD set. The problem is, it was released in PAL, so it suffers from a 2% speed up rate, and I think it also had some incorrect frame rate issues. As always, though, the fans went one step further, and there's some really incredible restorations of the 1982 Incredible Hulk cartoons sourced from the video of these DVDs with the corrected frame rates and audio taken from the original broadcast and VHS tapes, matrixed together. It's incredible. They look and sound amazing, but I wish Marvel would get the rights to the Hulk worked out, as those cartoons were instrumental in getting me into comics when I was a kid. And it does prove that Jim Galton has a point. I've always loved the Hulk because of this show, and while Galton is really off about a lot of stuff, reading this, I did kind of fondly start to drift back to that Hulk cartoon, and it reinforces a lot of what he was saying with Marvel keeping up with television and staying in the attention and the view of children at this point. So like so many other magazines back in the day, we have to jump forward to page 64 to finish like the last quarter page of this article. I hate that. It not only disrupts the flow of the article, but the layouts are always completely different and all squeezed onto a page. It drives my OCD insane. Anyway, Marvel is getting into bed with a few people, and they're going to be splitting the production costs of a few things, including a version of the Nutcracker with a bunch of rock bands. Did I mention the other company that they were partnering with was Toei? Yeah, the guys who did Godzilla. If you thought that was weird, this section ends with the discussion about the Captain America Broadway play that they just finished. What? You've never heard of the Captain America Broadway play? Yeah, well, that would be because it never actually happened. But that in and of itself is an absolutely insane story. Marvel spent more than $500,000 on this play. After 4 years, the person who was basically championing its release just got so tired of trying to deal with it that she walked away and gave up on the project. The best thing about the Broadway play was that it was going to be about not like Captain America the superhero, but about this middle-aged, burnt-out version of Steve Rogers. Not even really Captain America. He was going to be slightly overweight and, according to the director, just be generally confused and bewildered by modern women and politics. So, Captain America play where he's a super depressed, overweight loser that doesn't fight crime. Man, I wonder how that never got made. But they spent years trying to make that play. And a lot of money. There are rumors that there were stage test performances, but I've not been able to verify that. So if you know anything about the Captain America play from 1982 to like 1986, I think, let me know, because she stuck around for a long time trying to get that made. Now, this final section is about Marvel looking forward and how they're going to be adjusting the company under Jim Shooter and Jim Galton to better fit what they see as the trends emerging in the industry. Comic Scene, which is primarily a magazine that would become known for coverage of comic book media like movies and video games and TV shows rather than the books themselves, makes an astounding deduction, pointing out that in all the blitz to expose people to the characters and get them out there and plaster their faces on anything and everything, less and less attention seems to be getting paid to the actual comic books that they're putting out. The quality seems to be getting worse, while Marvel's ventures into other areas seem to be eating up more of their time and more of their resources. They point out that especially with the emergence of the direct market, which Jim Shooter and Galton both do not seem to fully grasp the gravitas of, leaves them at the mercy of their fans more than ever. Shooter claims that fans have proven their interest in superheroes is cyclical, so he's not really worried about it anyways, and as we saw earlier in the article, he thinks that direct market readers are more forgiving. He's going to introduce some new Western and space fantasy series soon, and that will make sure they've got their bases covered. That's crazy. Jim Shooter is obviously an intelligent guy. He's not stupid. He says stuff where it seems like he knows what century he's living in. He doesn't really get Jim Galton and some of Jim Galton's really weird views, but then he turns around and says something like, "Don't worry. We've got science fictions and space fantasy and westerns." His words, not mine. What kid wanted to read a western in 1982? He's living in his childhood. If people are going to want different comics, they're going to want different comics, not the other comics that Jim Shooter grew up with in the 1950s that weren't even the good comics that people remember. Not the horror comics, not the pulp comics that have these huge cult followings for 80, 90 years now. Oh no, not those books. The really crappy, forgettable Western books. This is the kind of weird, irrational thinking that led to the absolute flaming pile that was Jim Shooter's New Universe in 1986 that cost Marvel so much money and so many people their jobs. And I will say as well, Jim Shooter's New Universe, while I can get behind the general premise of what he was trying to do, was so ill-conceived, so stupid, and so badly put out. And it cost a lot of people so much stuff and did so much damage to the industry. It's as bad as anything that Image did in the mid-90s, in my opinion. That's another reason that your Uncle Jerk has a huge problem with Jim Shooter. I keep getting people asking about that, and I want to try to go a little bit into more detail because I know a lot about Jim Shooter. I don't hate him just to hate him because it's popular or all because the fanzines were all bashing on him around the time. That's not it. I hate Jim Shooter for my own very valid reasons, thank you. Alright guys, well that is it for this week. Thank you so much for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed. Next week, we will finish off this issue of Comic Scene. Week after that, we will hit Volume 2, Issue 1 of Comic Scene. And I'm thinking about doing a special on the X-Men Pride of the X-Men animated pilot. If you're interested in seeing that, get in the comments section below and let me know. Thanks again for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, maybe even learned something. If you did, do me a favor, hit that like button. Think about getting in the comments section below and letting me know. Share these videos with your friends. If you really enjoyed what you saw, Hulk smash that subscribe button. If you do that, make sure you ding the little notification bell so you keep up with these doses of trivia that I'm dropping all the time. Thanks again for sticking with me. I hope you enjoyed, and as always, I really, truly, and honestly ask only two things. Keep hitting those local shops and keep reading comics.